Today I have with me Ms. Wendy Campbell, President of Campbell and Company Communications. Ms. Campbell, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to participate in this groundbreaking oral history project
You're
on
welcome.
Washington, D.C.'s African American Trailblazers in the PR field. You're truly paving the way for people like myself to follow. So speaking of Trailblazers, did you know Oldfield Dukes, who worked in Washington, D.C. and was considered an African American trailblazer in the PR industry? And what impact do you think he had on public relations?
Oh, of course I knew Oldfield. Everyone knew Oldfield. Oldfield was legendary. He was kind of the first and always very helpful when we were the young people at that time. Started businesses. You always went to Oldfield and said, hey, I'm starting a business. What kind of advice do you have for me? And he was always very open and welcoming. So his impact was huge in that he gave you access to his contacts. He gave you sort of his wisdom and experience, sort of what to do, what not to do, how things could go so horribly wrong. So for me personally, he was one of the people that sort of helped pave the way and showed people that African Americans could own successful public relations firms. Because when I started in '94, there weren't that many. Mm-hmm. Still not today, there are not that many, but yeah, his impact was huge. He's greatly missed.
Grace, thank you. So I've spoken to several PR professionals, and a few of them started out in PR specifically. What was your PR journey?
Oh, mine was circuitous. I started off working in broadcasting with Kathy Hughes way back in the early 80s. I worked when it was just one station. I moved there. I moved to broadcasting up in Connecticut, working as a producer for a CBS affiliate, where I also started writing advertising copy. I then segued to working for a nonprofit for 5 years, where I did more marketing versus PR and communications. And in fact, my first PR job didn't occur until I was in my 30s, per se, when I was recruited to come work for Porter Novelli. I got a phone call from a friend saying, hey, there's a job open at Porter Novelli. And I said, what do you all do? She said, we're a PR firm. And I said, what do you all do? So even at that point, I hadn't really been exposed to PR and PR firms and that kind of structure. So that's how I ended up in PR. I did that for a couple of years and then just kind of decided, hey, I can do this on my own. Mm-hmm. And I thought I'd do it on a much smaller scale and sort of jumped out there, and one thing happened, and 20 years later, I still have the business.
Here you are.
But I will say that the experience that I had early on was not wasted. Mm-hmm. What has helped me stay in business has been some of the skills I learned working for the nonprofit, working in broadcasting. Just having that diverse background really comes in handy in PR, because PR doesn't require one set of skills. Mm-hmm. It requires skills, knowledge of the media. It requires knowledge of working with intermediary groups and other types of organizations. So all of that was helpful and has been helpful.
It all kind of fed into each other. Thank you. So I took a look at your website, and I saw a few of the campaigns that you're working on, and I found myself doing exactly what I guess you wanted people to do on your site. Like, I stopped and I stared and I read.
Yes.
And remembered.
There
you go.
That's our sort of mantra.
Yeah, I like that.
We develop campaigns that are memorable.
And they were, and I specifically remember your early literacy campaign. So with all the campaigns that you've had, what are your career highlights and your most successful campaigns?
Wow, that's a hard question because it's always the one I'm working on now, which is always my favorite. I'm like, this is my favorite campaign. But a couple of them stand out. One is the early literacy campaign for DC Public Libraries. For years, I wanted to do a fully illustrated campaign, and just never get a client to sort of buy into it. And this was the perfect opportunity to develop a campaign that sort of looked like a children's book, which was the goal. And so to this date, that's one of my favorites, even though it's one that's more recent. Some of my other favorite campaigns go back a ways, and they go back a ways because of what I learned from those campaigns. And going back to some of the work I did in the late 90s down in the Mississippi region, Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta, and why those were critical and why those were my favorite is because I learned about how the lack of resources impacts your ability to do certain types of PR. Mm-hmm. For example, when we were doing work down in the Mississippi Delta, what we heard and what we found out is that we want to bring large groups of kids together. Well, there was no public transportation system in part of the region. You know, there's a great influence from church leaders, even more so than up here, because you're in the heart of the Bible Belt. So, you know, when I work on national campaigns and we have to do programs that go out to some of these local communities and in rural communities and other states, I go back to the work we did in Mississippi and South Carolina, and that really helps to inform the kind of campaigns that we do, which is why we're generally, I would say, always successful. I mean, we're always successful. Some are more successful than others, but we always sort of nail it based on just having some of that fundamental knowledge of how things work outside of the D.C. area and outside of big cities.
Right, and I'm glad that you said that. So what would you say the difference would be from working in Washington, D.C. as opposed to anywhere else?
Well, Washington, D.C. being we always call it a tale of two cities, because you have the very well-educated, knowledgeable, well-read, affluent parts of the cities, and then you have wards 7 and 8, which in many cases resemble some of the low-income neighborhoods in other parts of the country, like a Mississippi or a South Carolina or Detroit. The difference is, well, I don't know if there's a huge difference. The difference is who you talk to, who the gatekeepers are in different communities. In Washington, D.C., some of the gatekeepers to getting work done may be city council members, heads of agencies. Where you go to different parts of the country, some of the gatekeepers may be clergy. They may be, they may be heads, university presidents. So, and that's one difference. How do you get information out? Who are the gatekeepers? The other thing is, D.C. has no lack of media outlets. So when you're talking about earned media, you have a lot to draw on. In other parts of the country, that is not the case. Particularly if you're targeting maybe African Americans and Hispanics, there may be one black newspaper or one Hispanic newspaper, and the general market media outlets don't cover the community to the same way. So you have to be a little bit more creative in how you reach populations. So those are just two differences.
Okay, thank you for sharing those. So in this phase, we are also featuring the late Moss Kendricks, who is often referred to as the first African American in PR. What do you know of his legacy, and how do you think he paved the way for African Americans in the field?
It's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with Moss Kendricks at all. So what I did do is Google him, and then it was like that aha moment. Like, oh yeah, okay. He was one of the original Trailblazers. He was doing PR when, this was not, before it was PR, before it was an industry, and even for Black people could really imagine sort of doing this type of work, and using, segmentation strategies that we still use today. And, hey, we should give him credit for that.
Right.
But I wasn't familiar with him. But I'm glad that you asked the question so I could go back and research, what his contribution was to the industry, because it's significant and critical, and he should be celebrated for being, in the forefront.
Thank you.
And at a time period when it was hard to convince the advertising industry that black people were even worthy of selling products to, that there was a need, and that the image that they wanted to put forth should be different. And I know, we struggle with that today in 2014 with stereotypical imagery. So I know what kind of uphill battle and struggle he had.
Right, very true. So now that we spoke about PR professionals from the past, what advice would you give to future students or people coming up wanting to practice PR?
Know your craft. Learn your craft. Read everything you get your hands on, because, people hire you because you're just not knowledgeable about a particular issue, but you're knowledgeable in general. And so when you're developing any type of PR strategy, you have to know what else is going on in your community, in the world, that you can possibly piggyback on or tie into. So I would say that read everything, know your craft, make sure you're able to articulate it.
Right.
Make sure your writing is tight. PR, and I always say this when I talk to students, PR requires a couple of things. It requires you to speak well, write well, and think strategically. That's the base of the pyramid. So everything else goes there. The other thing I would say, if you have an opportunity to go work for a big general market firm, stop there. Stop there, learn some of the tricks of the trade. Because I worked for Porter Novelli and starting my own firm, I was able to learn some of the learn some of the tricks of the trade. How do you present to clients? How do you write a proposal? How do you present a new business idea to a proposal? It's just not you walk in and you sit down and you present it, but there are some very what's the word I'm looking for? There's some ways to package it that you can only learn there, but you can easily learn inside of these big firms. If you get inside of a big firm, don't stay in a box. Make sure you understand how research ties into public relations, how advertising ties into public relations. Make sure you learn other parts of the firm. What I see with a lot of younger black people is they're brought in to work on one account, and they stay with that account. But you have to talk to your colleagues and figure out what they're doing, and volunteer to work on other assignments that are outside your comfort zone. Outside your comfort zone. So
that is some really good advice. Thank you for that. As we come to a conclusion of our interview, I would just like to ask if what other Washington, D.C. public relations professionals that you consider trailblazers would you say made significant contributions and impacted the public relations profession?
I would say I think you ought to stop by and talk to Gwen McKinney.
Okay.
Gwen McKinney has been doing this longer than I have, and successfully. She worked on some of the highest profile initiatives going back to the 90s when we're working on, I think it was Rwandan relief. When she worked on, I can't even think of it, but hunger strike issues. And so she's been around for a long time. She does work that's sort of socially conscious. So we're kind of white hat firms in that way. White hat firms, we do good work. I don't do alcohol or tobacco and things like that. But she's definitely a person to talk to.
Okay.
She's at the top of her game.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And is there anything else that you would like to say in conclusion? Or?
In conclusion, I probably would say, going back to the younger students at this point, is that public relations is really not for the faint of heart. It's not for people who are shrinking violets. It's for people who can become. You don't have to be comfortable right now, but can become comfortable presenting ideas and information to people who may have a lot more power and influence and knowledge on a subject matter than you do, and becoming comfortable in that space. I mean, I've had to present to a room full of 100 doctors on something they're much more well-versed in than I am.
Right.
But the key is to understand what it is that you bring to the table. And I don't need to be a doctor to talk about how to communicate health issues to different populations, but it's that comfort level that you have to get, and getting out there in front of these different groups.
Right. That's some excellent advice. Thank you for providing that. I'm taking notes myself.
You don't need. And one more thing. If you get an opportunity to get international experience, I say this to everybody. I say this to everybody in the office. If someone, not even if someone asks you, ask yourself, why aren't you getting international experience? We're working in a global. This is a global, system. It's a community. Take a year, take 2 years, and try to find an opportunity to work overseas in some capacity of communications. That will set you apart from other people. Young black kids are somewhat invisible in the international affairs and international communications arena. And so if you get that experience, you can in part write your own ticket down the road.
Good advice. Global.
Go overseas, do something fun, and it's fun.
Yes. New experiences. Well, Ms. Campbell, I just want to say thank you for taking out your time to
You're
do
welcome.
this interview. You've definitely provided some fantastic insight, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.